everyone.
Well, hello everyone. Tonight we are going live, which is always exciting. And we have a few things that we're going to do tonight. But the first thing, we're going live with a friend of ours who graciously agreed to join us.
That's
So
right.
as soon as he logs in here,
Wow, that was quick.
excellent. Accept.
Okay. Here's hoping technology works smoothly.
Exactly.
And we're joining.
Hello,
Hello.
hello. How's it going?
Good. How are you today?
Doing good. Is my connection clear?
Yes. Are we all right on our end?
All good. You know, the spirits of Wi-Fi.
Yay.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, thanks for joining us tonight, Tyler. This is so exciting.
Of course, I wouldn't have missed it. I was excited to get to hop on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, tonight we just wanted to go live with you and talk a little bit about, well, our work, mediumship, but also some of the more exciting components of, the vast theories of spirit, of liminal spaces, of some of the exciting work you've been doing.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly never a dull moment. Mediumship is such an interesting thing. I think for me, it's so much more than just spiritualism, which, if we know the history of it, we know it started in the 1840s, along with Millerism, Mormonism, and then, of course, spiritualism, which was in upstate New York. So for me, my goal has been to kind of, look at the past, but also do mediumship in a bit more of a modern way.
Exactly. One of those really cool things, and this is something that we have been talking about, was the ways in which we see and interact with the spirit world. And beyond just feeling spirits or speaking to them, or in some cases visually seeing them, magicians, occultists, esoterists have utilized vast tools to kind of see if they can pierce that veil a little bit more clearly or get
In
different
different ways.
types of information.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you have been building and built a psychomantium in your space. And I was wondering if you could tell us all about that process, what maybe inspired you to do that, and your successes so far.
Sure, sure, sure. Well, the psychomantium really in its inception for me was inspired by Dr. Raymond Moody, who wrote an amazing book called Reunions, which really
Mhm.
covered his work in trying to explore what a psychomantium is. It harkens back to a really old process of trying to connect with souls and one's higher self, actually going back to ancient Rome and Malta. And through that process, basically, oftentimes mystics would go into caves or in dark spaces. And they would have these really profound experiences in the dark where they would get impressions from loved ones who've passed and sometimes just information about overall guidance in their life. And so Dr. Raymond Moody, who was really interested and actually coined the term near-death experience, made it a point to try to implement that into his work by trying to kind of facilitate communication with the other side. And so with that, I took that idea, I bought his book, and I constructed my own psychomantium, which was quite interesting. Now, the funny thing is it did certainly help to have a place to meditate, but it really, in hindsight, was quite underwhelming. It really kind of was more of like a dark room that I was able to go in and just kind of concentrate and focus. And I started kind of realizing as it was being built that it was so much more than just a space, that it was really more about getting oneself into a mindset. And so, the goal of the psychomantium, for those of you who are not aware, is really to try to create an environment that basically minimizes distractions or sensory input. So that means noises, visuals, distractions, right? But I found as I was building it that really it was more of a process of getting into it in oneself, being able to kind of, close your eyes. And that's all the darkness you need, to kind of connect. And then going into a quiet space. I mean, that's all it takes to connect. So I learned very quickly it was really more of a physical thing that can be done internally.
Right. I wonder if it makes a difference that you yourself took the time to construct this versus you just like walked into a dark room.
Exactly. I think intention is very powerful within spirituality, and that's such a good point. I do think it certainly makes all the difference. Because we all have dark spaces we can go into and make a meditation room or a prayer space. A lot of people have those. But it really is about intention for sure. And really the liminality, which I would love to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes when people talk with us about like seeing surfaces or going in and creating like a kind of makeshift psychomantium, there's a lot of hang up on the images on the mirror or on the reflective surface if you're using one.
Right.
And a lot of people wonder, like, well, what if I'm not seeing something? Or what if I'm getting a lot of things, but they're overlaid images and they don't make any sense? And I've kind of walked back a little bit from the images themselves, especially if you look at like Dee and Kelly's work on scrying, where it kind of begins to feel a little bit like they're just really moving from intuition more so than what exactly images or uh, visual information was coming through that surface. And it does kind of harken back to it just getting into a space where you can feel yourself and become aware of all the things around you as the person.
Totally. I think really, if anything, intuition is a subtractive process, not an additive one. So it's really just about kind of eliminating those blocks that prevent us from living intuitively and kind of getting into that mindset. And I've really found through my understanding of liminality, which we're going a little deep here for
Yeah.
the average person, but for those who are not aware of what scrying is, scrying is the mechanism in which a person takes a reflective surface and basically just gets into a mindset where they then can intuit information from that reflective surface. And historically, that has roots with Nostradamus, going back to scrying with water, reflective surfaces. The oracles of ancient Rome and Greece did the same thing essentially. And then in more modern times, we see mirrors often being used for that purpose. So it all kind of interconnects, and I think is about really getting into more of a liminal state. We have a very structured life in general. We wake up in the morning, we do our tasks, we have our routines, and that's very structural. And I think the key to really tapping in spiritually is being able to create anti-structure in a certain environment. And liminality is really the key to that and facilitates that.
Because that is a paradox, right? Like creating anti-structure. And Kat and I, we attempt to live anti-structural lives insofar as we find that that helps kind of boost some of the connectivity that we experience or some of the success of our ritual work. But how can someone just create anti-structure?
It's tricky. I think it goes very strongly around deviating from what one normally does, deviating from one's typical routines. Interestingly, a lot of spirituality and esotericism is about trying to maintain a certain spiritual routine, sometimes meditating or praying at certain types of day, yada yada. I find more success with just kind of embracing liminality, embracing spontaneity. One of the interesting things I've learned in my work is that very often people will notice more signs from loved ones who've passed when they are actually traveling. And one wonders, well, why is that? Why do people seem to have a higher incidence of kind of being communicated with when they're going about into the wilderness, so to speak, or going about on a journey? And I don't think that's accidental. I think that there's always been a relationship with liminality and spontaneity. And the more you can implement that into your life, the more I think the universe has to work with in showing you certain things and guiding you in certain directions.
Exactly. So would you say that your psychomantium is an engineered liminal space?
I would say so. And one that actually ironically became very structural to the point where I had to tear it down because, it, if anything, I think really helped me understand that it's more about up here versus, any necessary space.
Yeah, this is something that we find as like a repeating pattern in a lot of like the ritual work that we look into. So when we're talking about like great occultists or great magicians or great even psychics to that degree or mediums, many of them seem to go through this process. And Crowley is a great example of being someone who says, I'm so into structure, I'm so into meditating, I'm so into doing these elaborate rituals, which are based off of elaborate, pseudo-Egyptian texts. And then towards the end of life, taking a step back and saying, you know what? No, I don't actually think we need this. I don't think, maybe we do need it. Maybe we need that structural component simply to step away from it at the end and say, I guess I didn't need that.
Exactly. It really is kind of a paradox, as you said earlier. In our pursuit of structure, we discover that anti-structure is really where the magic happens. And, I found also there's something to be said about the difference between objectivity and subjectivity. And I think that, when it comes from a more materialist standpoint, people want objective proof, evidence, something that can be quantified. But when you look at spirituality and the history of spirituality, mediumship, that kind of thing, a lot of it is very subjective. It can't be quantified. And I was reading a really interesting quote in a book that I actually don't recall right now, but it was basically something to the effect of magic is in meaning. And it's all about meaning. Subjectivity and meaning have a direct relationship. And it's very true. I think subjectivity is really where a lot of the magic exists in life in general.
Yeah, there's this wonderful element of trying to pursue like hard facts and hard evidence of the work that we do. And there's a frustration in that that seems implicit in it, that it seems like it's a core of it. We just came off of doing a seance, and we set up a lot of recording equipment because we wanted to capture what was going to happen. And sure enough, for the entire 2 hours that we were doing this, the cameras just wouldn't record. And it was so frustrating because I so like want to share what's there. And yet this is something that we see kind of popping up over and over and over again.
Totally.
It reminded me of the trickster and the paranormal. Just
Oh yes, which is one of my favorite books, and it's kind of the great irony of, UFO photos are always really grainy, and
Mhm.
Bigfoot, if he exists, he might just be really blurry by nature. So it's the funny thing. I mean, the paranormal does have a way of often evading structure and authority and institution.
Mhm.
So I deeply believe that there's a liminal element to the paranormal. I don't quite have it figured out as far as how they exactly relate, but I know they do unequivocally.
Mhm.
And then anti-structure has to in some way relate to the paranormal. There's just too much evidence to indicate that.
Right.
Yeah, that's so interesting and kind of poetic, I think, thinking about all this.
It's so
But
true.
yeah, meaning is so important when we're looking at these spiritual experiences, which are incredibly difficult to talk about and convey the meaning of. It feels like in conveying or talking about something that happened that was deeply felt, emotional, and almost metaphorical at times, you kind of lose it by speaking about it. And I know that like many occultic authors would say that as well, but I've had experiences in my life that are so difficult to really convey or capture.
Totally. By design. I think that really is by design. And interestingly, in The Trickster and the Paranormal, which is a great book by George Hansen, if for those of you who are interested, it really goes on. He's a parapsychologist who studied a lot of different interesting things. And he found that the paranormal really does have some kind of self-cloaking mechanism. And it's very true. And that in and of itself is pretty interesting. And then kind of going on to what you were just saying about subjectivity and the magic of that, when we look at William James, who went on about the 4 qualities of a mystical experience. I always get him confused with the poet William Blake, so bear with me there. I think it's William James, right? But his 4 qualities were ineffability, meaning that the experience transcends words. You had a noetic element, which is the second one, which kind of sends a person down a lifelong path for knowledge after they have their mystical experience. You have transiency, which means it's typically very short. And then passivity, meaning it's just typically very immersive. And it's so interesting when you go over those 4 things with people. A lot of spiritual people will say, oh yeah, I've had a visitation from a loved one, or felt, even in a church setting, some people feel the presence of God.
Mhm.
And then that all fits that definition. But then you also have people who aren't religious, who often can relate to those feelings as well. Being out in nature, that sense of
Yeah.
awe that one gets when they're surrounded by the trees. I think even people who aren't quote unquote spiritual can relate to having mystical experiences and may not even fully realize it.
Mhm. Yeah, we talk a lot about like this idea around like high strangeness, right?
Right.
And the concept of something that is so just um, in, indescribably or inexplicably weird. And while high strangeness does mean kind of its own thing, I've often found it to be somewhat useful in explaining or bridging that divide between people who consider themselves maybe to not necessarily be very spiritual or very mystical, who are maybe turned off by words like religious or spiritual experience. And they're like, yeah, I did have that experience, which was like deeply weird, that was deeply strange. And we've had our own high strangeness experiences, but I was wondering if there's any that really like pop to you as something that you look back on and say, I should have interacted with that differently, but it meant everything to me and it keeps me awake at night.
For sure. Oh, there's no shortage of those stories. But I would say
Yeah.
it kind of reminds me of the quote you actually introduced me to. Not everybody believes in ghosts, but everybody has a ghost story. And
Mhm.
that I thought that was very eloquently said, that it really does permeate culture. It's just people oftentimes kind of disregard that which they can't quantify or process into their worldview. As far as high strangeness goes, I think readings in and of themselves are highly strange. I have had certain experiences, particularly things that had physical manifestations in the room that, for me, kind of tick that box a little harder. Particularly after my reading with LaToya Jackson, funny enough, I actually left, and as I was leaving, I got a phone call that the lights in the building had shut off and turned back on, and we had just finished discussing that her brother Michael communicated through lights going off and on. So again, subjective but meaningful, and it was certainly coincidence that, to me, was a little too on the nose to just be disregarded as an electrical problem. You also see this, though, across the board. I mean, I did a reading with Kenya Moore, I believe her name is. She's a housewife of Atlanta, I believe. And during our reading, she actually we were doing this reading in this diaper, I know it sounds weird, but basically a maternity store. So there were diaper bags and everything. And as I'm communicating with her loved one about this newborn baby that she's about to have, the diaper bag behind her just flies off the shelf and lands on the ground. Now, again, I think timing is everything. And when people are saying, well, how do I know the difference between just a coincidence or something meaningful? I always just say, look at the meaning of it. Look at the timing of it. Does it kind of strike you in a way that's more than just chance? And I would say those are perfect examples of kind of high strangeness at work.
Yeah.
That's very intentional too. I think if it were more subtle, a lot of people would just miss it.
Yeah.
Totally.
There's a fear for many people of claiming weird experiences as something that might be paranormal. And I don't know if that fear comes from or is rooted in a concern of being kind of laughed at or considered to be maybe a little crazy. And I'm sure there's part of that. But then also I think there's an overarching kind of narrative in the spiritual community and the spirituality community of doing things in the quote unquote right way, and then discerning between, actual real experiences versus an experience that you've just invented in your brain. And I take a little bit of issue with that. I think it might be rooted in the right place, as in, we need to be discerning and conscious observers and not walking around being dictated by any weird happenstance. But if something strikes you as, stands out to you as weird, or stands out to you as, oh, this is something, then it can be. And it can be to just let that sit and say, okay, that is what it is.
Totally. I think there's such a disdain for ambiguity in the world in general. And I think people very much like to pin things down and put things into categories and have it be black or white. But for those of you who know what liminality is, you know that liminality is ambiguity. It's this weird middle ground, these threshold states, these transitional states. And so the paranormal very often elicits that ambiguity. And most people are not comfortable sitting with that. Most of us have to kind of implement it into our worldview in one way or another. The more I've learned, the more I've just learned to accept that things are what they are, and I'll never have it figured out. And I don't think anybody will have it fully figured out. And I think there's a certain peace that comes with that acceptance if you can get that in this lifetime.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. The point is the exploration. And obviously you're looking for answers, you're looking for more knowledge sometimes and enlightenment. But just accepting that you won't necessarily get to know everything, maybe even those personal experiences, you won't fully understand every piece, every facet of it. I think that can be freeing in a way.
Totally. And I think it's necessary, because you see people losing their mind after a while if they're trying to figure it all out. And, it's just oftentimes kind of, I think, like an illusion, the idea that one can.
Yeah. And I think in some ways that's also, at least for us, because we often get asked about paranormal stuff or consulting on paranormal stuff.
Yeah.
And hearing someone speak to their experience with that level of kind of just blunt, okay, I was, in your case, doing a reading for someone about their unborn child and the diaper bag flies off the wall. To some observers, they would say that's too on the nose, that's too cliche. To me, that kind of reeks of some degree of realness, because it is so just weirdly on the nose. And there's a comfort that I feel, or a level of comfort with those stories that to this point, it's kind of gotten easier to deduce, what is at the heart of what they're telling me? How are they embellishing this? Because there's this element of just discomfort weird. Like I don't
Yeah.
quite know how to articulate it, but it's there. There's like a little bit of awkwardness,
You
and I
want
like
to
that.
integrate it into
Yeah,
yourself.
Yeah.
yeah. Because sitting here now, even though we've seen weird stuff,
Yeah.
hearing Tyler say this, I'm like, I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know, man. But I know because I've seen things like that, and I
So,
have no reason to doubt what you're saying. It's just
yeah.
that's the hallmark of a valid experience or a truly odd, strange experience.
Absolutely, and the ineffability behind it, it transcends words, and it puts us into kind of a weird state where we have to reflect on ourselves and the very core of what we believe in and who we are. And that in and of itself is kind of staring into the abyss, so to speak. So
Yeah.
it certainly can make people feel a little funny, but yeah.
Which I guess is a seg here into an idea about the models of like the way we approach spirit and or the way we approach this weird like esoteric world. So for us who do a lot of ritual, who do a lot of like magical praxis, and I know we've spoken about like some magical workings and manifestation and that sort of thing. I would love to know, because you're a medium and not someone who just considers themselves to be a ritual magician or a an occultist, where do you come down on this model of like of the model of woo, if you will? Like, is this a spirit model? Is this a mental model? Maybe some of both. How do you kind of integrate that?
Yeah, well, I certainly believe that consciousness has a continuation. That's fundamental to my belief. The jury's still out on whether, I personally believe that our mind can affect the external surroundings. As we see, the point of a lot of ritual, both religious, esoteric, spiritual, is very much about trying to establish some sense of control over that which typically can't be controlled. And, simultaneously, I don't want to poo-poo over people's ritualistic experiences because, even within Catholicism, you see the rosary beads. That's a form of ritual. Then you obviously see the more alternative versions of that. I think whatever gives people deep meaning, it can't hurt. And oftentimes these external practices facilitate a deep sense of subjective change. And so for that, I think there's great value. I mean, I think even if you look at, Crowley and all the other kind of new thought leaders and things like that, a lot of them were kind of unsure how much what they did actually affected the outer world as much as it might have just affected their kind of more internal states. For some for the better, others for worse. Certainly, if you look at some of these people's lives, they struggled with, addiction and illness and various things. So like the law of attraction, for example, I'm very hesitant to embrace just because I think that magical thinking can be kind of dangerous in the wrong hands, but so can a butter knife, right? So, you have to just be conscientious, and just as long as I think a practice, a spiritual practice embodies or implores you to do better, to be better, to find deeper meaning, then I think it has great value.
Right.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And it's cool because you see it across the board.
Yeah. No, definitely you do. I think one of the things that always stands out to me, because I do approach this from like a blended model, like as someone who's received messages from spirits, I feel like there has to be survival of consciousness. There has to be some kind of continuation of the spirit in one form or another. But as someone who's also had a lot of success with ritual work, I don't necessarily think that all of that is necessarily predicated on spirit involvement in our lives. And part of the reason I always want to stress that is because I think sometimes people get very concerned about what their ancestors are up to, how spirits, like specifically of discarnate souls, are impacting their lives. You get a lot of questions around not only looking for closure or healing from, a loved one who's passed, who maybe had strong opinions about your life choices, but then also wondering, well, can that person affect, my outcomes, or can my ancestral if you would, intercede in some behalf or affect my work? And I wanted to know how much, if any, you feel that spirits do have like a place within manipulating the physical or working through the physical space.
So if we look at, the diaper bag example, clearly something was amiss. Something was going on that had very real repercussions in the physical realm. That said, I really don't know. And I think I've kind of gotten to the point of having to get comfortable with the idea of I don't know. I don't find it to be a comforting thought that, that there are discarnate beings that influence, the trajectory of our lives. I have found that they often do present opportunities for understanding, and that can be very valuable. But yeah, I'm less inclined to think they're kind of navigating the ship, so to speak, and we're just, the passengers on the boat. But however, I will say a lot of religions do believe that. A lot of spiritualities are oriented around the idea that, spirits or discarnate beings, forces of good and evil, have, great influence. And it's like a ping pong match between the two forces in our lives. I choose to take a little bit more of an accepting approach of just kind of wanting to integrate it all for what it is. And I put less emphasis on trying to change things, I suppose, even through spiritual means. But I actually read a really interesting book recently called Sacred Disobedience. And I think I might have sent you the book. But that was so fascinating because this author, who's a religious scholar named Sharon Coggin, I believe, she delved into the history of Pan. And Pan being kind of the essence of nature, and how, with the emergence of the Judeo-Christian religions, Pan kind of was killed off as far as being the leading man, and then vilified quite strongly. That alone was really fascinating because, with the rise of Neoplatonism, which is really the idea that there's a single supreme source of goodness, that spirituality in its truest form is perfection, that kind of ended up messing up our world a little bit. And it was interesting because when it was explained, at first I was like, okay, how does that make sense? But as I learned more, with the rise of Neoplatonism, things started getting viewed in a really interesting way where illness, childbirth, all these things, all these very normal human experiences were viewed as imperfect because they were not of your spiritual core or not of a higher power. And so then you got healers and faith healers thinking even today that somehow they can cure illness by invoking God, because as if illness wasn't created by God. That in and of itself doesn't make any sense. But the interesting thing about that was, as you see Neoplatonism emerge, you see basically people start discrediting their human nature and discrediting nature in general, because they didn't believe that it was perfect inherently. And so with that, you saw the emergence of us destroying the environment, neglecting ourselves, trying to escape this planet. And I mean, we even see it recently with, billionaires trying to get us to space, meanwhile using resources that are harming our planet. So it's a very interesting narrative on Pan, nature, and I think, hopefully as time goes on, we can integrate that more into public consciousness, and people can embrace, things for who they are and what they are, and not vilify things as much.
Right.
Well, we see that in, as you mentioned, New Thought or Law of Attraction kind of work, where there's really a fundamental flaw insofar as there's no theology of suffering. There's no problem of evil. What do we do with bad things? And it ends, and sometimes
other than we cause them.
Other than we cause them, right?
Yeah.
It ends in unfortunate places where people are saying, "Well, the hurricane was caused because those people were thinking about it." Well, that's obviously not where we want to end up metaphysically. So I think there is this incredible wisdom and wellness in taking just a little bit of a step back from labeling these things as purely good or purely evil or the result of some kind of cosmic intervention, and recognizing them as experience to some degree or another, which sounds lofty when everything is fine. When everything's going great, it's just an experience. When you're in the thick of it, that's an entirely different matter.
Absolutely. And people really,
Sorry.
Oh no, I didn't mean to interrupt, Kat, sorry.
No, we're again dwelling in that liminality, in that non-dual kind of thinking, which is so difficult to maintain, for good reason, because it is difficult to kind of suspend belief. I think something that stops you from thinking differently.
Well, it's what's his name? I'm blanking on it now too. Robert Anton Wilson. Who has that great quote about
I don't believe anything.
Exactly.
But I have many suspicions.
Yes.
It's a great quote and a funny one. He's such a character, or was, he's still floating around somewhere, but he certainly was an interesting thought leader.
I'm seriously hoping I'm seriously hoping one day he comes through in either one of your sessions or one of ours, just because I imagine that would be the
He
ultimate,
would be
just
mad.
like, I would be upset personally because everything would be right off the rails, but looking back, I'd be like, that was awesome.
He'd be breaking the fourth wall for sure.
I,
Um, there's this great book I wanted to share with you. It's called
yeah.
Liminality and the Modern, and
Mm,
it's by, and I'm probably butchering this, but Bjorn Thomason. And it's a really good book, very expensive, but really worth every penny.
yeah.
And it's the reason I'm showing this because for those who are interested in liminality, as it really is a key to the paranormal, it's one of my favorite book covers. And you can't see it very well, but you have kind of this pan figure down here, and you have all these bubbles, and all these people are grasping at these bubbles. And in these bubbles, they have examples of liminality, like policy, betting, games of
Mhm.
chance, pretty interesting things that you kind of think would be unrelated, but really aren't. And I found that really interesting. And like, even if you go back into looking at like the liminality of, I actually did a post on Lenormand cards and how games of chance have always kind of had this relationship to divination and to
Mhm.
kind of consulting the universe. And it's so interesting how like a game of dice really isn't that different than, throwing some runes down and, trying to
Yeah.
divine what's happening. So that always struck me. I mean, once I got it, I was like, oh, wow, there really is a relationship, an interplay, if I might say, between spirituality and fun, and recreation, leisure. Those are all very liminoid. Victor Turner has a great book also called The Ritual Process, where he gets into just that. He's an anthropologist, about liminoid being kind of like liminal experiences, but more fun, like bungee jumping, that kind of thing. And how it kind of really forms who we are individually and culturally.
That's so interesting because I think when you said bungee jumping, Grant Morrison, the comic book artist who's also a renowned chaos magician, uh, literally jump-started his career in the comics industry, which is a very difficult industry to get into, by launching a sigil while bungee jumping. So that's a
There you
great
go.
little sync to pick up on.
Oh, that's
I
funny.
find that terrifying.
Yeah.
I didn't know that, but that makes complete sense.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
taking the jump.
Yes. And
Yeah.
there's an element of with the game aspect because this comes up a
You
lot
guys
with.
are killing me.
Sorry. Well, this comes
No,
up a lot.
I've been thinking about games for the past couple days
Yeah.
and just writing. I know we're on the same wavelength.
Yeah.
But just thinking about what you were saying about the relationship between games, fate, play, experiments, and well, what we do, magic, and all these things being interrelated and woven, and I love it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Pete Carroll, again, chaos magician. It was either Pete Carroll or
You're
Phil
just throwing
Hine.
it
I always
out
mess them
every
up
chaos.
every single time. Writes that the first thing one should do if they're interested in becoming a good occultist or magician or working their will in the world is to relearn how to play. To like relearn how to play like a kid. Go out and buy yourself some Legos or something. Because it's something we so easily disengage from. And sure enough, went out and bought some Legos, and I really had a hard time like re-getting into that mindset of a little kid of like, oh, I'm having fun. Like
Right,
that was
right.
hard.
It's surprisingly difficult. And it's funny that you say Legos because models are
Mhm.
implicitly liminal, and you even see them in
Ah,
film. So there you go. I mean,
yeah.
literally, this book goes into how models, the smaller versions of bigger things, are liminal implicitly. You see it even in like horror movies like The Shining with labyrinths, which are also liminal. I mean, I could go on all day, but it really is fascinating. Harnessing
No,
that.
it is.
Reading.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated with miniatures. It's been something that like I really like. I grew up building models and now lately I've been on this kick because I want to at some point manifest by whatever you will bring into being a Victorian home, but it has to be very specific. Like it can't be too haunted. It needs to be specific,
Just
Right.
enough.
just enough.
Just enough.
And I've seriously been playing with the idea of like building it in miniature, which is also the premise of quite a few horror movies. So
There you go. It's how it starts. You've seen
yeah,
the tropes. That's
yeah,
funny. Yeah,
I mean,
it's very true. I think it really does speak to, that kind of inner child. And, from a Jungian perspective, we all have that inner child inside of us. And I think a lot of spiritual work is just kind of getting back in touch with that inner child in a way that's not damaged and wonder and doing things that allow us to seek adventure, I think are a great way to reconnect to that inner part of ourselves. And I would argue are really key to like a lot of spiritual praxis. Like we look at, I mean, I don't want to get into too many people because I don't want to talk about people necessarily, but like some of the most powerful mediums, spiritualists, people in the realm of mental abilities are very childlike, sometimes even kind of man-childlike. And I don't think that's on accident. I think there's certainly some reasons why some people are just more inclined to be more their inner child all the way through adulthood. And with that can correspond certain intuitive abilities.
Yeah. I think there's a evidence or an emphasis is the better term. An emphasis often placed on spiritual things being not only discipline, but like discipline in like a negative way. Like going and, you know, for an example, as someone coming from Catholicism, going to daily mass was often viewed or talked about as a very spiritual and rigorous practice. And it can be beautiful. I'm not decrying that in any way. I find a lot of beauty in that. However, as a child, you're like, this is really boring and I hate this. I don't want to keep doing it. And as you kind of grow, there is this discovery of the spiritual practice does not have to be sitting in a room. It does not have to be meditating for 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours a day. It can be if you want it to be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And that can be freeing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Co-signed.
It doesn't have to be meditation either,
No.
which again is another freeing thing. And I wondered also if this is a good time to talk about art creation, because art is so ingrained in play and experiment, and sometimes even being more your childlike self. And there's this like history of channeled art creation that I find really fascinating, and I wonder if it happens more than we think, maybe.
Totally. I would argue anyone who's like under the pressure of having to write a book is probably automatic writing and probably doesn't realize it. You know, and I think a lot of, you know, great poems, great, you know, we could argue our Constitution might have been automatically written. That might be a bit of a stretch, but you know, it's an interesting thought that you know, what inspires us comes from somewhere, right? And oftentimes I believe that's separate than ourselves. And I think we're just kind of conduits for information. And as you said, you know, the creative process is such a intuitive process. You have to know where to start, but then equally when to end. And whether that's on a painting or a book, there's a lot of usage of intuition there that just doesn't get enough credit, in my opinion.
There is. Alan Moore, the artist again, wrote a really incisive piece on specifically magic, where he called out esoteric orders, occult practice, Western magic, and said, listen, it's been 100 years now, and what have we produced? Like, what has the Golden Dawn produced? And his thesis is that it's ultimately art, that the ritual workings to bring in like physical aeons or new gods or intense and immeasurable wealth were very scattershot in their success. But what was routinely successful was the creation of books, the creation of poetry, the creation of great paintings. Aleister Crowley, while many people, of course, remember the persona, he has a dearth of bad poetry. Anyone can go and read. And it doesn't matter that it's bad, because it came from somewhere.
It's true. Good.
And someone might see it. He did. So someone sees it.
It's one person.
Yes.
No, you're right.
I think that's very much an outpouring of the spiritual process. And I mean, I saw you doing the stained glass, which has its own kind of like interesting element of like hard work. Pain is involved with it a little bit. There's some altered states of consciousness there. Intense focus. I think stained glass is a very hot process, like intensive heat. Am I correct?
There can be, yep. When you go to solder things and it's, you know, risky, and there's an element of suspending all of what, you can't focus on anything else, or else you'll accidentally cut yourself. And it's a very intentional process for sure, from beginning to end, that takes days to complete, even sometimes some of the smaller pieces. So it certainly relates. And, you know, speaking to what you just said about, you know, the creativity aspect of it, I mean, culture absolutely has been changed by the New Thought movement, and you know, small groups of early religions, we know what we call those, and then, you know, they become part of culture, which is actually interesting. There's always been a relationship there, and I think there's a reason for that. And interestingly, I think culture often kind of disregards what doesn't work, and then takes things from these different people that did work and integrates it into what becomes mainstream. So I think these people kind of, they're the movers and the shakers, and they disrupt order, but I think often in a way that does leave humanity at least more in the know about certain things, for better or for worse. But I do think it's for the better ultimately. I think you can look at people who were spooky in history and learn a lot from them, how they lived, how to do things, and also how not to do things. And that has great value. That's, to me, very few things can give that degree of value about the human condition and human experience. Totally.
Definitely. So looking to those people, who would you cite? And we talked about a ton of people tonight.
Oh yeah.
Who would you like really pull out as like, this is an inspiration or an influence on your work? It doesn't have to be another medium or anything, but who influenced you? Who influences Tyler?
You know, I have given that a lot of thought, and I think they all creatively influenced me. As far as my work goes, I really resonate with Daniel Douglas Hume, who was a physical medium. And he was a really interesting one. He was kind of like the Uri Geller of way back in the day. He was said to be able to levitate and do all of these crazy things, which sound very insane. But people had a really hard time debunking him as much as they tried. And he performed openly in front of some of the leading minds of the time. And he certainly inspires me, I think, because of his courage. I think if it takes courage to be a medium today, which it does, it took courage back then, to the 10th degree. So I would say for sure he's a big one. What about you guys?
Kat?
Ursula K. Le Guin, who is not a medium but a science fiction writer.
Yes.
Some of the ideas she fleshes out in her books have inspired me to act in the way I've acted, to maybe be a little bit braver in order to be what I am today.
I love that.
But we've talked about Robert Anton Wilson, and I like his controversial, not controversial for the sake of being, but for the sake of challenging himself and challenging his own beliefs. And then Jodorowsky.
Yeah.
I could probably name a bunch. Oh, Mitch Horowitz is
of course.
We love Mitch. Mitch is amazing.
Great teachers. I love people who are able to take difficult subjects, especially ones that I'm interested in, and really explain them in a way that's accessible to everyone. That quality is so, and you have that, Tyler. That's something that you have.
Oh,
you know that. Don't
precious. Yeah. You're very kind. Dan, what about you? Who do you think? Same answer or different?
A little different insofar as I really resonate with some of the early surrealists. Not because I'm a painter by any stretch of the imagination, but I think that to do the kind of work that we do as mediums, as occultists, as whatever you want to say, in the world of alternative spirituality, there is a real element of looking at the world not as it presents itself, but as you kind of want it to be, as its imaginal space. And I find myself more and more existing in a kind of imaginal realm or an imaginal space.
Sure.
And it can be unmooring sometimes, but I really like that. And I really like the courage that some of them had to kind of step out and say, you see a clock, well, the clock is melting. I love that.
Sure.
I love that kind of weirdness, not for the sake of just being a weird person, but for relishing in the oddities and the truly bizarre take on consensual reality. Essentially, it was challenging and evoking elements of consensual reality, and I like that.
That makes total sense. The absurdity of things, because life really is absurd. People like to tell themselves it's not, or put everything into nice little boxes, but there is such an absurdity to existence that is fascinating. And I think the work you both do kind of delves into that in a way that it is courageous and is fascinating. And I think everybody is generally inspired by people who do live their truth in such a way where they're not afraid to be who they are, and that's just commendable. Absolutely.
Well, hopefully I can live up to that.
You do. You both do.
Thanks.
Up to our own expectations.
Up to our lofty expectations. That's the worst part.
Yeah, well, there's no shortage of ones that came before us, as far as magical people or people who, thought differently. And I think there's a lot to learn from those people.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to learn from those people. And then also the people who you don't really expect or don't consider to be particularly challenging or groundbreaking. Because like a lot of people Kat mentioned or who you mentioned are groundbreaking individuals. And I recently was reading a book, and I come from central Pennsylvania, so I'm very familiar with the Amish, the Mennonites. And I was reading a book about the history of the Mennonites and how they originally, when they were in the country, when they immigrated from Germany, were very involved with mysticism and like mystic thought, and then super super influenced by the indigenous cultures that they found themselves butted up against. And not in like a weird kind, I'm sure there were historical weirdness, so I don't want to speak too much, but there was, for the time specifically, an extremely respectful kind of give and take taken by both the indigenous cultures and these Mennonites.
Right.
And having grown up in that, I never saw it. And to be honest, I don't know if it's still that way. I don't want to speak too much about that. However, looking at that through like a kind of new lens or knowing that unique quirk of history, I was really able to kind of pull some new things that had always been there that I had kind of maybe looked over or not contextualized or not understood. And so I really always think that like we should really focus on sometimes people who we don't consider to be particularly exceptional or wow, that person is really leading the way, because there are these unique hidden histories to like everyone.
Yeah.
And I love when those kind of pop through. And once they do, then it recontextualizes everything. And you have to look at it with these new, fresh eyes. I love that.
Oh, absolutely. Everybody is holding a mirror, and I think there's something to be said there. And even the people we think we've looked at and are done with, I find myself going back and looking at thought leaders and people I don't necessarily resonate with. I've looked at the materialist movement and people within that. And it is really interesting. They all have something to teach if you can suspend your ego. Which really becomes the harder part. I think the more people know, the more that knowledge kind of gets embedded in their ego and their belief systems, and it gets harder to integrate new information. So I try to maintain a very open mind, and I'm certain about very little, so I think that's how I'll always operate, because it starts getting, the waters get kind of muddied if after too long, if you have too much certainty about too many things. So.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
That's true. Well,
Absolutely.
We'll see how we grow and evolve over time.
Yes, definitely. Well, you guys, it's been great talking to you. I have to run here shortly, but you guys have given some really thought-provoking questions, and I really appreciate your time tonight.
Well, thank you so much.
And we need to find our Henry readings list.
Yes. So if you ever get that to us, we'll share it out with people.
Absolutely. We got books. We got it all. I'm going to make a book. It'll be like Oprah's book club. I'm going to do it one of these days. You'll be my first members.
Substack. It's got to be an email list Substack.
Oh, yeah. Whip out the newsletter.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thanks so much, Tyler. This was great. Have a great night.
Amazing to the viewers as well. Thank you for watching, everybody. Wishing you the best, and I'll see you all soon. Thank you. Bye.
All right. And thanks, everyone, for joining us. We're the Eckharts. You can find us on theeckharts.com or on our Instagram page. We do group mediumship readings digitally and in person. We do seances, and we love joining all of you tonight. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, have a good rest of your evening.
Exactly. Bye, everyone.
Bye.